June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy breathed smoke and rain. The sea still smelled of iron from the invasion, and the roads that led inland were carved into deep ruts of mud by the weight of tanks, trucks, and the endless march of men. Along those same roads, behind the lines, a convoy rolled quietly one evening under the shrouded light of blackout lamps. There were no division markings, no regimental banners. Only faint stencils on their trucks hinted at a strange designation: 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Within those vehicles sat men who carried not rifles but paintbrushes, sound recording reels, and rolls of canvas. Their mission was unlike any other in the war. They were sent not to destroy, but to deceive, to conjure the illusion of entire armies that did not exist. It had begun in secrecy months before the invasion. The idea had grown from desperation as Allied planners studied the strength of the German defenses in France. They knew the deception before D-Day Operation Bodyguard had worked. Now they wondered, could such illusion continue on the ground in real time, confusing the enemy as the Allies advanced? The answer came from a handful of officers with a strange proposal: create a mobile unit whose purpose was to impersonate other divisions. They would become the ghosts of the battlefield, making the enemy believe strength where there was none, and absence where power gathered unseen. It was a dangerous art. If caught, their flimsy disguises would offer no protection. Rubber tanks do not stop bullets. The first recruits were drawn from places far removed from the mud of Europe: art schools, advertising agencies, sound studios, men whose hands were trained for creation rather than destruction. They came from the Cooper Union, Pratt Institute, Yale, and the streets of New York, where posters and murals had been their canvas. Some had painted billboards for toothpaste. Others had studied architecture or set design. They arrived at Camp Forest, Tennessee, uncertain why they had been summoned. They soon discovered that their brushes and imaginations had become military tools. They would learn camouflage, radio discipline, and the physics of sound. Their commanding officers taught them how to build an army out of air. Their workshop was as secret as their orders. Inside hangars, they tested inflatable tanks, rubber trucks, and dummy artillery pieces so light a few men could carry them. Engineers designed compressors that could fill the decoys within minutes, their hiss echoing through the night like serpents. The painters studied real equipment down to the last rivet and replicated every detail. They invented ways to age the rubber, dust it with soil, and make sunlight gleam off the fake metal skin. From a distant sand to a spy plane's lens, the illusion was flawless. When lined up in fields, these ghosts of armor seemed ready to roll. The airmen who photographed them from above had to be told which were real. Alongside the visual deception came the music of war. The Army Signal Corps provided portable recorders, and teams were sent to capture the sound of engines, treads, and clanking chains from real divisions. They cataloged the noise of artillery batteries, half-tracks, and heavy trucks until they could recreate an entire army on magnetic tape. These recordings were then played back through massive speakers mounted on jeeps, broadcasting across valleys and ridgelines. To a distant listener, it was the unmistakable thunder of movement, the grinding of steel, the shifting of divisions, the rising and falling chorus of engines in motion. Paired with the sight of inflatable armor and the chatter of fake radio operators, the illusion became complete. Their training was brief but intense. They learned to operate like stagehands, striking and rebuilding their theater of war in hours. They moved under cover of darkness, setting up decoy camps, laying out fake tire tracks, stringing laundry to suggest the presence of thousands. They painted insignias of other divisions on their trucks, then repainted them days later when their role changed. In daylight, they remained invisible, posing as mechanics or engineers, always in motion, never revealing the truth of what they carried. The deception demanded precision. For one careless error, wrong unit number, a voice on the wrong frequency could unravel the act. When orders came to ship overseas, the men felt both pride and unease. They had trained for a war of shadows, but now they would enter a continent drenched in real blood. On the crossing to England, they listened to the drone of the ship's engines and wondered what would happen if their work failed. Would they be blamed for lives lost? Would anyone ever know what they did if they succeeded? Most of them were in their early 20s, still half astonished to find themselves enlisted in something so secret they could not even describe it in letters home. England in the spring of 1944 was a fortress of waiting. Every field seemed filled with trucks, jeeps, and tanks. The men of the 23rd blended in easily. They were, after all, surrounded by the very equipment they meant to copy. They studied the real divisions, memorizing their markings and radio habits. In pubs and mess halls, they listened carefully to the cadence of officers' voices, the slang of tank crews, the rhythm of army conversation. It was theater, but the audience carried guns. When they spoke over the airwaves, they needed to sound exactly like the men they impersonated. Some nights, they rehearsed these transmissions in blackout tents, switching call signs, adjusting signal strength, learning to occupy the invisible world of static and code. In June, when the invasion began, they waited. News of the landings spread through the camps like fire. Many of them felt frustration. They had built an army of illusion, but had yet to prove it could stand beside the real one. Weeks later, the call came. They were to prepare for movement across the Channel. Their mission was to support the advance into France, drawing enemy forces away from the main thrust of Allied armor. They packed their strange equipment. The rubber shells deflated and rolled like canvas, the sound gear carefully crated. To the unknowing eye, their convoy looked ordinary. Only those inside understood they carried not weapons, but tricks. They landed in Normandy after the beaches had been secured, but while the countryside was still deadly. The air smelled of cordite and damp earth. Fields were pocked with shell holes, and every hedgerow hid the memory of fighting. Their first assignment was near Cherbourg, a test of whether illusion could survive in a war zone. Under cover of night, they inflated tanks and set up dummy artillery positions along a secondary road. The sound crew placed their speakers in a line, broadcasting the low rumble of engines. The radio operators imitated the chatter of a non-existent armored division. When German reconnaissance planes flew overhead at dawn, they saw exactly what they were meant to see: another Allied column preparing to attack. The deception worked. German forces shifted artillery to counter the threat, easing pressure on the real troops miles away. The men celebrated quietly, aware that discovery would mean ruin. They had to vanish as completely as they appeared, dismantling the phantom army by nightfall. The process became second nature: inflate, deceive, disappear. Each operation was a performance with no audience applause, only the faint satisfaction of knowing someone somewhere had believed the lie. They joked about being the Ghost Army, a name that stuck, though it was never official. To them, the title felt right. They moved like ghosts seen, but not touched, always between the lines of the living and the dead. As summer deepened, their confidence grew. Each mission carried higher stakes. They supported feints before real attacks, imitated divisions that were hundreds of miles away, and broadcast false traffic to cloud enemy intelligence. They began to think of their work as both art and war, a collaboration between imagination and discipline. Yet they never forgot the fragility of what they built: a stray reconnaissance patrol, a curious farmer. Even the wind shifting at the wrong moment could betray the illusion. Still, they pressed on, learning that in this war, deception saved lives as surely as bullets took them. By the end of that summer, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had become masters of their strange craft. They had proven that illusion could fight alongside reality, and that art could serve strategy. But the greatest challenges lay ahead, where the stakes would rise with every mile eastward. The fields of France had tested their courage. The vast and uncertain road to Germany would demand even more. The Ghost Army was no longer an experiment. It had become a weapon of its own. By late summer, the war had entered a new phase. France was breaking open, the German lines retreating eastward toward the Seine, but the map remained treacherous. Commanders demanded mobility, and with it came a constant need for deception. The Ghost Army, still largely unknown even within the Allied ranks, was on the move again. Their trucks rolled through liberated towns that smelled of smoke and fresh bread, past villagers who waved flags and offered wine, unaware that these soldiers carried rubber and paint instead of mortar and shells. To those cheering crowds, they looked like any other American unit. In truth, they were artists in uniform, technicians of illusion, about to perform acts of war that no one would ever read about in the papers. Before they reached the next assignment, their convoy paused in the countryside outside Rennes. The night was still, the hedges alive with insects, and the men set up a small encampment to rest. Here, under canvas lit by oil lamps, their peculiar army came alive again. Painters unrolled sketches of camouflage patterns and topographical maps. Engineers cleaned compressors and checked valves on the inflatable armor. Sound technicians crouched over reels of magnetic tape, adjusted the playback of engines and artillery barrages, layering tones until the illusion of an advancing column filled the tent. The air shimmered with the hum of invention. These were not soldiers waiting for orders. They were craftsmen rehearsing for a performance that would play out across entire valleys. Their commanders understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The Germans had begun to regroup with alarming speed. Intelligence reports warned of counterattacks, of mobile reserves moving through the forests of Brittany. To misdirect them, the Ghost Army would need to simulate large-scale troop movements, hundreds of vehicles. Thousands of men where only a few dozen stood. Failure would not mean embarrassment. It would mean exposure, capture, or death. The deception had to be total. The smallest inconsistency could betray the act. Tire tracks that didn't match, antenna lengths wrong for a division, or radio transmissions that didn't follow standard procedure. Every detail mattered. War had become theater, and the stakes were measured in lives. Preparation for each mission began long before the first inflatable tank touched the ground. The visual deception teams, mostly artists from universities and design studios, studied reconnaissance photographs of the area. They mapped where real divisions were positioned and where the ghosts would appear. Using these images, they arranged decoy battalions on paper, calculating the distance between fake motor pools, artillery sites, and living quarters to mimic authentic layouts. They even planned for signs of human life, rows of laundry, cooking fires, and latrine pits to convince enemy scouts that thousands of men occupied the terrain. It was artistry driven by precision and fear. Meanwhile, the radio operators rehearsed their dialogue like actors preparing lines. Each impersonated a specific division with its own rhythm and tone. They memorized call signs, officers' names, and slang unique to those units. At night, in the tents, the air was alive with static and code. Abel Fox, "This is Dog Baker." One would murmur into a microphone. Another would answer with deliberate fatigue. Dog Baker receiving. Stand by for traffic. The illusion required not just the sound of transmission, but the texture of routine. They practiced keeping logs, stamping papers, even filling message pads with authentic abbreviations that could withstand inspection if intercepted. Everything had to sound lived in, authentic. Ordinary, the highest compliment in a world of deception. The sound specialists refined their art as well. They had recorded the real movements of tanks and half-tracks weeks earlier, using mobile microphones near active divisions. Now they blended those recordings with environmental noise-wind rain, echoes from valley walls to create the illusion of motion through specific landscapes. These tapes were then loaded onto massive speakers mounted in the back of trucks, each capable of projecting across 15 miles. The first time they tested the full system in France, the roar rolled over the hills like thunder. Soldiers from other units, unaware of the deception, looked up from their camps in confusion, wondering which armored column was passing in the dark. The Ghost Army watched and smiled. Their creation had fooled their own side, always a promising sign. When the orders finally arrived, the operation unfolded like choreography. Under a moonless sky, convoys moved silently to prearranged sites. In open fields, men unfolded canvas, unrolled tubes, and attached hoses to compressors. Within minutes, the shapes of Shermans and half-tracks began to rise from the ground, their rubber skins shimmering under faint lamplight. Others laid tracks through the mud, driving real jeeps to imprint patterns that would match those of a full division. Painters worked quickly, darkening sections to simulate shadow and adding the telltale marks of wear. They used brushes dipped in oil and dirt to mimic exhaust stains on the fake armor. From a distance of a mile or through a reconnaissance lens, the deception would be perfect. At dawn, the sound trucks took their positions. As the sun climbed, a deep mechanical growl rolled across the countryside. The tapes played on loop, engines idling, chains rattling, the rhythmic bursts of artillery. The vibrations carried through the earth, faint but convincing. In nearby villages, civilians paused and listened. To them, it was the sound of liberation approaching. Two German intelligence officers listening from miles away. It was a clear sign that the Americans were massing forces for another assault. Reports began to circulate through enemy headquarters. New armored units sighted near Rennes. Commanders shifted artillery and reserves to meet them. The real Allied divisions positioned elsewhere, advanced with reduced resistance. The men of the 23rd were elated, yet their success had to remain invisible. They knew no official recognition would come. Their orders demanded anonymity. They were to leave behind no trace that could reveal the Deception-O equipment, no documents, no footprints that didn't fit. By the following night, the entire Phantom Army was gone. The tanks deflated, folded, and packed into trucks, the sound gear silenced and stowed. When German scouts returned, they found only trampled grass and cold ashes. To them, it was as though the Americans had vanished into air. In the days that followed, new assignments arrived. The Ghost Army operated like a traveling troupe, each mission a different play on a new stage. They impersonated the 4th Armored Division one week, the 80th Infantry the next. Their insignias changed as often as their locations. To preserve secrecy, even friendly troops nearby were not told who they really were. Many mistook them for engineers or supply men. Some guessed correctly and laughed, calling them the Rubber Cowboys. The ghosts smiled but never confirmed. Their war depended on silence. Between operations, the men wrestled with the oddness of their duty. They lived near the front, but rarely fired a shot. Their courage was measured not in kills, but in how convincingly they could pretend to be an army. They risked capture without the honor of battle, imprisonment without the dignity of combat. Yet they understood their purpose. Each successful ruse saved lives, real soldiers spared from ambushes, real towns liberated with fewer casualties. It was enough to keep them working through exhaustion and fear. When artillery rumbled in the distance, they reminded themselves that their own tools, rubber, paint, and sound had altered the direction of that thunder. As summer turned to autumn, the scope of their missions expanded. Headquarters began to assign them tasks supporting major offensives, using deception not only to hide troop movements, but to mislead entire divisions. The men adapted, refining their techniques after every performance. They learned to vary the pattern of lights in their fake camps to mimic soldiers on night duty. They adjusted the timing of their radio traffic to reflect the rhythm of active combat. Every adjustment deepened the illusion, making it less a trick and more a new kind of warfare, one fought in the mind as much as on the ground. By September, they had staged more than a dozen operations across France. Each one blended art, mathematics, and nerve. They could set up an entire armored division by nightfall and vanish before dawn. They could make the enemy believe strength where there was none. But in the back of their trucks, rolled tight in canvas, their creations waited for the next call. The war moved eastward, and they would follow, bringing their shadow army into Belgium and beyond. The success near Rennes had proven the impossible was real. A lie told with precision could save 1,000 lives. Yet, even as they celebrated quietly under the French stars, the men sensed the weight of what they were doing. Deception, once a tactic, was becoming a necessity. And the war, still far from over, would demand illusions darker and grander than any they had yet imagined. Autumn settled over France with a weary grace, the fields still scarred from months of battle. Roads once lined with smoke and refugees now carried convoys of weary men, supply trucks, and the strange, unmarked vehicles of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The war was shifting eastward. Paris had been liberated, and the German army was falling back toward the Siegfried Line, that vast chain of fortifications marking the edge of Germany itself. For the Ghost Army, the victories brought no rest. Every advance demanded new illusions. Every success required another layer of deception to conceal the real movements of the Allied armies pushing toward the Rhine. They were masters of appearance now. Each mission began with reconnaissance photographs spread across wooden tables in tents. Under lantern light, officers traced lines of railways, bridges, and towns, marking places where the enemy still held ground. From these maps came the choreography of illusion: how many tanks, how many trucks, which roads they would occupy, and how they would be seen from the air. It was a strange kind of battle plan, not to take territory, but to convince the enemy that territory was already held. Orders were read softly, assignments divided. The artists and engineers prepared their new weapons, the inflatable tanks, jeeps, and artillery that had become their strange companions. The equipment itself was evolving. Early designs had been crude: thin rubber skins that tore easily, seams that leaked air in the cold. Now, the craftsmen improved them with layered coatings and paint that caught the light like real steel. They added subtle details: machine gun barrel that cast the right shadow, a star insignia carefully positioned to reflect authenticity. Engineers built new compressors capable of inflating a tank in 15 minutes. the men worked with the precision of stage crews, each knowing his role by heart. They could turn an empty field into the camp of an armored division before dawn and have it gone again by nightfall. Their artistry extended beyond sight. The sound units, known as the 3132 Signal Company Special, perfected the auditory illusion of war. They had begun collecting real sounds from active divisions months earlier, capturing the rumble of engines, the metallic grind of treads, and the echo of artillery. In makeshift studios, technicians layered these recordings into complex sequences columns, starting engines at dawn, trucks idling, tanks moving through mud, and distant gunfire fading into the night. Each reel was labeled meticulously: armor, medium column, wet ground, or half-track convoy, cobbled road, played through giant speakers mounted in jeeps. The sounds could be projected across valleys, bouncing off hills to create the impression of motion miles away. The men called it sonic trickery, but it was a science of deception so advanced that enemy scouts often reported entire armored divisions that existed only in sound. Beside the sound units worked the radio specialists, the 406th Signal Company. Their task was to impersonate real divisions by mimicking their communications. They studied authentic logs and call patterns, learning the language of the airwaves. Each operator played a role in an invisible cast, commanding officers issuing orders, logistics units requesting supplies, artillery reporting coordinates. To maintain realism, they even built fake radio towers, complete with dummy antennas. At night, their voices drifted into the ether, weaving a web of signals for German intelligence to intercept. The enemy's listening posts, flooded with chatter, dutifully noted every movement. The deception reached into the very heart of their command rooms. The synergy of sound, sight, and signal turned the Ghost Army into an orchestra of illusion. Every performance had to be synchronized. If a fake tank column was heard moving along a road, reconnaissance needed to see tire tracks the next day. If radio chatter spoke of a headquarters being established near a village, the visual team had to build the illusion of a base there. Tents, vehicles, and even campfires. Men placed empty ration tins and cigarette butts to give the impression of human presence. They drove trucks in loops to mimic heavy traffic and let the wheels carve deep ruts into the mud. The deception lived through the smallest details, those that the human eye caught only subconsciously, yet which made the illusion breathe. One night, near the city of Metz, they prepared for one of their most ambitious missions yet. The plan was to create the illusion of the Ninth Army assembling to strike the fortified city from the west. The real assault would come from another direction. The Ghost Army's task was to make the enemy believe otherwise, to pin down German artillery and reserves long enough for the true divisions to break through. Under low clouds, their convoy arrived at a desolate stretch of countryside. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and gasoline. The men began their quiet labor, inflating tanks, positioning fake trucks along the tree line, and erecting radio masts. The sound crew unrolled cables and tested their amplifiers, the faint hum merging with the rustle of wind through the grass. By dawn, the Phantom Army stood ready, hundreds of rubber tanks lined across the fields, glistening with dew, waiting for their cue. When the operation began, the illusion unfolded perfectly. The speakers came to life, echoing the mechanical thunder of advancing armor. From miles away, it sounded like the grinding of a vast steel host. Radio transmissions crackled with fabricated reports of troop movements. Aerial reconnaissance planes circling overhead captured the silhouettes of armored vehicles and radio antenna clusters. To the analysts in German intelligence, it appeared that a massive Allied force was preparing to attack Metz head-on. Commanders redeployed units from other sectors to counter this threat. The ruse worked. When the real offensive came from the north days later, it struck thinner defenses. The city fell sooner than expected, and few ever knew that rubber and sound had played their part in its downfall. The cost of such success was secrecy. The men could not speak of their missions even to fellow soldiers. They shared no medals, no official reports that bore their names. Sometimes they arrived in an area only to find neighboring divisions puzzled by their presence. Orders from headquarters required silence, and so they kept to themselves, their campfires dimmed, their laughter low. Many of them kept journals, sketching their equipment or jotting down brief thoughts about the day's work. One wrote simply, "We build ghosts, so real they cast shadows." Between operations, they rested in the ruins of French villages, sleeping in barns or abandoned schools. The locals treated them like heroes, offering bread and wine, though none could explain exactly what these Americans did. Some of the men painted murals on cracked walls, images of tanks and soldiers that mirrored the illusions they created on the battlefield. For a moment, the war receded, replaced by the quiet hum of brushes against plaster. It was strange comfort in a world where art had become a weapon. Their next orders came swiftly. As autumn deepened, the Allies pressed toward the German border. The Ghost Army was tasked with creating diversions along the Moselle River, where bridges and crossings were fiercely contested. Each mission demanded precision timing, coordination with real divisions, and absolute trust in secrecy. They operated close to enemy lines, sometimes within artillery range. There were moments when the illusion became almost too real, when German shells, mistaking rubber for metal, rained down upon the decoy camps. Men dove for cover as air hissed from punctured tanks. The explosions left no casualties, but shredded the fabric of their creations. They laughed afterward, shaken but alive, calling it the only time in history that an army was deflated under fire. Yet every time they rebuilt, the work grew more confident. They refined their craft, adapting faster than the enemy could learn. Their commanders began to rely on them as a hidden advantage of force that could alter the enemy's perception at will. The line between truth and illusion blurred. In some operations, the Ghost Army's presence on the map convinced even Allied units that they were a real division, leading to logistical confusion. It was the highest measure of success, to deceive both friend and foe. By the time the leaves began to fall, the Ghost Army had staged more than 20 deceptive operations across northern France. Each one saved lives, buying time for the advancing armies. Their legacy grew in whispers, passed through radio rooms and command posts. Some officers spoke of the invisible division that appeared wherever the front was weakest. Others dismissed it as rumor. The men who lived the truth never confirmed or denied. They simply packed their equipment, rolled their tanks, and moved on to the next field. Behind them, silence and flattened grass marked where shadows had once stood. Winter was coming, and with it, a new kind of war. The line ahead was tightening. The forests of the Ardennes would soon echo with the thunder of a desperate German counteroffensive. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops did not yet know it, but their most perilous and decisive performance was drawing near a test, not of illusion alone, but of endurance, courage, and the fragile art of surviving unseen. The cold came early that year. By November 1944, the winds sweeping across the French plains carried the edge of winter. The Ghost Army, by now lean, confident, and restless, had followed the front line into the Eastern Territories, moving through villages where the church bells had only just begun to ring again. Their orders were simple, but never ordinary. Stage another illusion, another phantom force, to draw the enemy's gaze away from the true advance. Yet the deeper they moved toward the German border, the thinner the line between safety and exposure became. The war, once vast and distant, now pressed close enough for the men to feel its breath. They arrived outside the town of Metz, beneath a sky the color of slate. The ground was soaked, the fields scarred with trenches and shell holes. It was here that the Germans had built some of their strongest defenses, determined to hold back the Allied tide. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were tasked with a dangerous role, to impersonate two entire divisions assembling for an assault, while the real attack prepared miles to the north. With a dangerous role, to impersonate two entire divisions assembling for an assault, while the real attack prepared miles to the north. It would be their most complex deception yet, requiring coordination of visual, sonic, and radio units with flawless precision. A single misstep could draw fire upon them, or worse, reveal the trick before it began. The men studied the terrain by lantern light. They marked roads, slopes, and tree lines, calculating where fake tanks would cast the right shadows at dawn. The engineers tested compressors and patched punctures in their rubber armor. Painters moved from vehicle to vehicle, adding streaks of grime and faint bullet marks, small imperfections that made the decoys believable. The sound crews rehearsed in the dark, fine-tuning the roar of armored engines so it would roll naturally through the valley. They listened to their own recordings, The way musicians tune instruments attentive to pitch and rhythm, the subtle rise and fall of mechanical life. Even the radio operators, their fingers poised above Morse keys, practiced the cadence of traffic patterns that would mimic the pulse of an army on the move. When the operation began, the landscape transformed into theater. The convoy arrived under the cover of mist, headlights hooded, engines muffled. In fields along the Moselle River, inflatable Shermans and trucks began to bloom from the soil. Men worked silently, the hiss of compressors echoing faintly through the fog. By midnight, dozens of tanks stood in neat rows, their rubber hulls gleaming wet under the pale moon. From above, they would seem indistinguishable from real armor. To complete the illusion, truck tires carved false tracks into the mud, and fires were lit to suggest the bustle of soldiers at rest. The air filled with the low hum of generators and the murmur of voices carried over speakers. A ghost army had materialized in a single night. At dawn, the deception came alive. The sound units unleashed their recordings. Engines starting, commands shouted, artillery rumbling in the distance. The valley vibrated with life that did not exist. On nearby ridges, German observers raised their binoculars and saw exactly what they expected to see: a formidable American force preparing for another strike on Metz. They radioed reports back to their commanders. Artillery batteries shifted. Reserves were drawn southward. The trap had sprung. For the men of the 23rd, success meant silence. They could not celebrate. For the men of the 23rd, success meant silence. They could not celebrate. They could only hold the illusion, hour after hour, until higher command signaled them to vanish. The waiting was the hardest part. During daylight, they stayed hidden among their creations, watching distant flashes of artillery. The ground trembled occasionally as shells landed far away. They could see smoke rising beyond the horizon, where real divisions were fighting under the weight of the German counterfire meant for them. Their art had bought those soldiers time. When night fell, they moved again. The fake tanks were deflated, folded, and packed with practiced speed. By dawn, the fields were empty, except for ruts and ashes. To any late observer, the army that had camped there was simply gone, as though swallowed by the earth. The men drove eastward to await their next orders. No one would ever know they had been there, and that anonymity, though necessary, began to weigh on them. They were saving lives in the shadows, leaving no monument to mark their path. The war grew darker as winter advanced. German resistance stiffened. Every mile closer to their homeland was met with stronger fire, colder nights, and fewer illusions that could last long before discovery. The Ghost Army adapted. They began using shorter operations, 1 or 2 days at most, setting up diversions that drew enemy artillery away from key crossings or supply routes. The deception became faster, more flexible, more daring. The men joked grimly that they were becoming the most shot-at unit without a single bullet fired in return. In late November, they received new orders. Move north toward the Ardennes. The forests there were deep and quiet, and Allied intelligence believed German forces were retreating. The 23rd's mission would be to simulate a buildup of reinforcements near the region's southern edge. It sounded routine, almost easy after months of complex work, but the men who had served long enough to sense the rhythm of the war felt unease. The silence of the Ardennes seemed too heavy, the calm before something vast and unseen. Their convoy wound through narrow roads bordered by skeletal trees. Frost gathered on the branches, turning them white in the moonlight. In villages long since abandoned, set up temporary camp small fires, flickering in ruined courtyards, the air sharp with the smell of damp wood. At night, they tested their speakers, letting a low growl of engines roll through the hills. The sound seemed to vanish into the distance, absorbed by snow and pine. It was a landscape built for ghosts, and the men felt it. When word came of the German counteroffensive that December, the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, broke like a shockwave. The Ardennes exploded with gunfire, and the 23rd found itself suddenly in the path of a force far greater than any illusion could contain. The Germans had launched a surprise attack through the very forests the Allies thought secure. The Ghost Army was not designed for direct combat, yet now they stood close to the line of fire. For days, confusion reigned. Real divisions fell back to regroup, and orders shifted by the hour. Amid the chaos, the men of the 23rd were told to hold their positions and continue the deception to make it seem as though reinforcements had arrived. To buy time for the retreating units to reorganize, they did what they had always done. In snow and freezing wind, they inflated their rubber tanks, camouflaging them with white sheets. The sound crews worked through the night, their fingers numb, adjusting volume knobs with stiff gloves. Recorded engines roared again, echoing off the frozen hill. Radio operators sent false messages, announcing the arrival of phantom brigades. From across the valley, the enemy responded with artillery fire. Convinced a major concentration of armor stood before them, shells screamed overhead, exploding among the decoys. The men hugged the ground, the smell of cordite thick in the air. When dawn came, they rose from the frost and rebuilt what had been shredded by shrapnel. Through that bitter winter, their courage was tested as never before. They had always known they might face real danger, but now the line between illusion and death was razor thin. Yet their performance held. The deception slowed German progress, giving Allied command precious hours to regroup. When reinforcements finally arrived, the tide of battle began to turn once more. The men of the Ghost Army, unseen and unacknowledged, packed their ruined tanks and moved on, leaving behind the echoes of a battle they had helped shape without firing a single shot. By Christmas, snow covered the remnants of their camps. The forest lay quiet again. But beneath that quiet pulsed the strange knowledge that art and imagination had saved soldiers, who would never know the names of those who had shielded them. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops drove east once more, engines humming beneath a gray dawn. Ahead lay Germany, rivers yet to cross, and one final grand deception waiting beyond the Rhine. The war's end was in sight, but for these men, the work of illusion was far from over. Part the 5th of January 1945 brought with it a different kind of light, pale, cold, and unyielding. The snow along the roads to Luxembourg was no longer white, but gray with soot, tracked by columns of retreating armor and the footprints of men who had been fighting too long. The Battle of the Bulge had torn through the Ardennes like a storm, and though the German offensive had begun to falter, the scars it left were deep. Towns were leveled, forests shattered. For the Ghost Army, the new year began not with celebration, but with exhaustion and renewed purpose. Their mission had shifted again. They were to continue their strange warfare of shadows, concealing the movements of the real armies regrouping for the final drive into Germany. The men moved north in long convoys, engines rumbling through the icy dawn. In every village they passed, they saw reminders of what their illusions were meant to prevent. Buildings split open by shells, empty streets, civilians wandering in silence. Their success was invisible, but the failures of war were not. Yet the orders were clear. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops would deploy near Luxembourg City and begin one of their most elaborate operations, to simulate the buildup of forces preparing for a renewed offensive into the Saar Valley. The real divisions, battered by the winter battles, needed time to refit and reposition. The Ghosts would give them that time by pretending to be an army that did not exist. They set to work in the freezing mud, pitching tents, erecting fake antennas, and inflating tanks that gleamed dully under the clouded sky. Snow fell in heavy sheets, clinging to the rubber hulls until they appeared dusted in frost like the real thing. The painters darkened certain panels to suggest shadow and wear, while others placed wooden boards beneath the decoys to leave the right pattern of tracks. Every detail mattered, even in winter. The sound units rehearsed with care, testing how noise carried through the snow-laden air. The cold absorbed the low frequencies, dulling the rumble of engines, so the technicians adjusted their mixes, amplifying the metallic clatter, sharpening the echo of gears. When they played it back across the frozen hills, it was as though an armored division was crawling forward beneath the fog. The radio operators worked from cramped trucks, their breath turning to mist in the dim glow of their instruments. They imitated the chatter of field headquarters, relaying fabricated orders about bridgeheads and artillery support. Sometimes they had to sustain these transmissions for days, maintaining the illusion of an active command post. German intelligence, listening from the other side of the front, dutifully logged each signal, believing the 6th Armored Division had massed near Luxembourg. It was one more ghost in a war already full of phantoms. At night, the camp took on an eerie beauty. Fires burned low, flickering against the outlines of inflated tanks. The snow muffled every sound except the steady hiss of compressors and the faint hum of generators. Men huddled in their coats, smoking in silence, watching their creations loom in the darkness like sleeping giants. Some joked that they had built the world's strangest circus, one where no tickets were sold and no applause would ever come. But beneath the laughter was fatigue. They had been at war for months without firing a shot, and yet the danger was constant. Enemy patrols roamed close. Artillery fires sometimes drifted their way when German observers spotted movement. One well-placed shell could puncture both the illusion and the men sustaining it. In early February, a new assignment arrived, a deception to support the crossing of the Roe River. This would require precise timing. The Ghost Army would simulate a division assembling to cross at one point while the real attack struck miles away. The sound crews rehearsed tirelessly, layering the thunder of pontoon bridges being built, engines revving on the riverbank, and the splash of water against barges. Engines revving on the riverbank, and the splash of water against barges. They even recorded the metallic clang of tools to sell the illusion of engineers at work. At dawn, when the tapes began to roll, the valley filled with the noise of preparation. German artillery responded within hours, pounding the phantom crossing site while the actual engineers, further south, worked undisturbed. It was deception measured in lives saved, an invisible exchange where illusion absorbed the enemy's fury. But not every mission went smoothly. During one operation near the town of Trier, the enemy's response came faster than expected. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead sooner than predicted, catching part of the decoy force still being assembled. A few of the inflated tanks lay half-finished, their rubber skins sagging comically beside the real trucks used to transport them. The airmen reported what they saw, an unusual concentration of equipment, some of it suspiciously light. That night, artillery fell on their position. Shells whistled over the hills and burst among the decoys, shredding the fabric and scattering debris across the snow. The men took cover in ditches, the ground shaking with each explosion. When the barrage ended, they climbed out and began repairing what they could. A tank patched and reinflated could fool another camera tomorrow. Failure was not an option, not even for ghosts. In those long weeks, the line between art and survival blurred completely. The men learned to sleep in shifts, to eat cold rations while inflating tanks, to speak softly and move fast. Letters from home, when they came, felt like messages from another life. They rarely mentioned what they were doing. Censorship forbade it, and words could not capture the strangeness of their work. How could they explain that they painted tanks instead of firing them, that they built an army from air and sound? One of the painters wrote in his notebook, "We create what should not exist, and because it exists, others live." It was as close to truth as anyone dared to write. By March, thaw began to touch the fields. The snow melted into streams that turned the roads to rivers of mud. The Ghost Army followed the advance once again, heading toward the Rhine. The war was changing shape. Rumors spread that Germany was collapsing, that the end was near. Yet for the men of the 23rd, there was still one great task ahead, the most audacious deception of all. Allied command was preparing to cross the Rhine River into the heart of Germany, and they needed the enemy to look the wrong way. The Ghost Army would stage a massive fake crossing upstream, complete with bridges, tanks, artillery, and the thunderous illusion of a full-scale assault. It would be their final performance, the culmination of every skill they had honed. As they drove east through the ruined towns, the men could feel history closing around them. Churches stood roofless, bells shattered, their silence louder than any siren. Civilians watched the convoys pass, their faces expressionless, the long fatigue of war etched deep in their eyes. The soldiers of the 23rd knew that victory was near, but their own work would end in silence, buried beneath the weight of secrecy. They were not heroes who would be welcomed home with fanfare. Their triumphs would remain locked in classified files, their courage hidden beneath the name of an invented division. Yet none of them complained. They had become accustomed to the anonymity of shadows. That night, as they set up camp on the western banks of the Rhine, the river glistened black beneath the stars. On the far side lay Germany, the final stage. The men sat quietly around their stoves, the air thick with smoke and cold. Some spoke of home, of what they would do when the war ended. Others simply listened to the water moving beyond the darkness. They knew what awaited them. One last illusion, one final act of deception that might determine how quickly the war would end. The Ghost Army, the artists of war, had come to the edge of the continent. Soon, their invisible hands would paint the last great mirage of Europe's most devastating conflict. The river mist hung low over the Rhine, a pale veil that turned every sound into a whisper. It was March 1945, and the war in Europe was nearing its final act. Across the water lay the heart of Germany, bridges shattered, cities burning, and armies retreating in confusion. The Allied command was preparing for one of the largest coordinated assaults of the entire war, the crossing of the Rhine. Yet the enemy still held the far bank with heavy artillery and watchful eyes. Every movement, every convoy, every sign of preparation could invite catastrophe. To make the crossing possible, someone had to draw the German attention elsewhere to make them believe the main assault would strike from a completely different point along the river. That task fell to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It would be their masterpiece, the illusion of an invasion that never was. They arrived near the small town of Viersen, just west of the Rhine, under a cold, starless sky. The roads were clogged with the debris of war-abandoned vehicles, burnt-out tanks, the carcasses of artillery pieces. Yet, amid the ruin, the men of the Ghost Army went quietly to work. Their mission was clear: create the appearance of two full divisions preparing to cross the river north of the real attack site. Every sight, sound, and signal had to sell the illusion. Failure meant drawing German guns onto the real soldiers downstream who would attempt the actual crossing. It was deception as defense, lie built to save lives. The first stage was reconnaissance. Under blackout conditions, officers scouted the terrain, walking the frozen fields with flashlights covered in blue filters. They noted where the river curved, where embankments could hide trucks, where the noise of engines would carry best across the water. The engineers marked points for bridges that would never exist. In the morning, the men began hauling out their equipment: compressors, hoses, and the deflated shapes of tanks and trucks that would soon fill the empty landscape. They worked through drizzle and sleet, fingers numb, air hissing from the pumps like serpents in the fog. Within hours, the meadows began to populate with an army that existed only in shadow and imagination. Inflatable Shermans stood side by side, their outlines softened by mist. Dummy artillery barrels were planted into the earth, tilted toward the opposite shore. Truck tracks were carved deliberately into the mud by real vehicles to lend the scene weight. From a distance, from an airplane or a riverbank observer, the illusion was indistinguishable from reality. The painters added streaks of grime to the rubber skins and brushed mud on the wheels to mimic wear. At night, lanterns were placed strategically to resemble the dim glow of encampments. Smoke generators puffed thin trails upward, suggesting kitchens and vehicle repair bays. To a watchful enemy across the Rhine, it would appear that thousands of men were gathering for an assault. The sound teams arrived next, carrying reels of tape labeled with care. Armor assembly, riverbank, bridge construction, 2 hours. They set up their massive loudspeakers behind hedgerows and barns, testing the echo of each track against the landscape. When the recordings played, the air trembled. Engines revved, metal clanked, shouted orders bounced off the water. Across the river, the German observers could hear what seemed to be an entire division mobilizing in the fog. They reported the sounds up the chain of command, and artillery began to reposition to face the phantom army. Every shell aimed at the illusion meant one less falling on the real bridgeheads forming downstream. Meanwhile, the radio operators of the 406th Signal Company filled the airwaves with chatter. They simulated entire headquarters communications, free quests for supplies, coordinates for artillery, and false confirmations of unit arrivals. The transmissions were meticulously coded to match existing Allied call signs. Some of the operators had practiced impersonating the voices of officers so often that they could recite orders from memory. German intelligence, still relying on intercepted radio traffic, noted the supposed presence of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions in the Viersen sector. The deception was working. It was as though an entire army had been conjured out of air. For days, the illusion was sustained. The men moved in silence, maintaining the appearance of constant activity. Trucks drove in loops to kick up dust. Inflatable vehicles were repositioned to simulate troop redeployment. Fires burned through the night, and sound crews varied their playback sequences so that the noise of construction ebbed and flowed like the rhythm of a real military buildup. The effect was mesmerizing, even to the men themselves. Standing among their creations in the fog, they sometimes forgot that none of it was real. The landscape throbbed with energy, with the heartbeat of an army that did not exist. But every hour of success carried risk. The Germans were no longer blind. Patrols scouted along the opposite bank, and artillery spotters studied the terrain with binoculars. The first shells came at dawn on the third day. They fell harmlessly into the empty fields, sending geysers of mud into the air. The men ducked instinctively, then rose again to check for damage. A few of the rubber tanks had been shredded, their deflated skins flapping in the wind. The crew patched them, re-inflated them, and the illusion continued. They knew that the more fire they drew, the more convincing their deception had become. Their battlefield was belief itself. As the days passed, the weather worsened. Rain turned the ground into a swamp of slick clay. Trucks sank to their axles. Generators sputtered under wet tarps. Still, the men persisted. They were working against time. The real crossing of the Rhine was approaching. Every hour they could hold the enemy's focus at Viersen was another hour for engineers downstream to finish their bridges and move armor across. The deception unit was now functioning with the precision of a stage company in its final rehearsal. Orders came quietly, movements executed flawlessly. By now, they knew their craft so well they hardly needed direction. A glance or a gesture was enough. The illusion had become instinct. On the night of March 23rd, the sound crews began their final act. The speakers thundered with the chaos of a river crossing, engines grinding, cables clanking, water splashing against pontoons, men shouting over the roar of machinery. The noise carried across the Rhine for miles. German artillery responded with fury, pounding the phantom bridgehead with hundreds of shells. The Ghost Army huddled in trenches, the ground shaking around them. When the barrage ended, the real crossing had already begun miles away, largely unopposed. The deception at Viersen had succeeded completely. By dawn, the men received the order to withdraw. They deflated the tanks, packed the rubber in canvas, wound up the cables, and silenced the speakers. The camp that had seemed alive only hours earlier now lay empty, its tracks already filling with rainwater. Across the river, German spotters peered through the mist and saw nothing but churned earth. The phantom army had vanished. The illusion had dissolved into the morning fog, leaving only confusion in its wake. Later, as they drove away, the men passed real troops heading east. Columns of armor and infantry rolled across bridges that now spanned the Rinde crossing secure. The road into Germany open. Few of those soldiers knew that the men who waved at them from the passing trucks had helped clear their way without firing a single round. The Ghost Army's greatest success would never appear in headlines or official communiques. Their mission reports would be stamped, classified, and locked away, their achievements hidden beneath the cloak of military secrecy. That night, they camped in a ruined orchard. Fires flickered low, reflecting off the damp metal of their vehicles. Someone played a harmonica softly, the melody carrying through the cold air. No one spoke much. They were too tired, too aware of what had passed. The deception at Viersen had been their finest work, the culmination of a year's worth of peril and invention. For the first time, they sensed the war was truly ending. The enemy was retreating toward the heart of its own ruin. Soon there would be no need for illusions, no more phantom armies to conjure. The artists of deception had painted their last mirage upon the fields of Europe. And the truth, the real armies, the real victory was now moving in behind them. April arrived cold and wet, the Rhine behind them and the heart of Germany opening ahead like a vast, gray wound. The Ghost Army, what remained of it, followed the advancing divisions across the flattened countryside. Cities that had once hummed with industry now smoldered in silence. The war was still raging, but its end could be felt in the rhythm of the days. Fewer ambushes, fewer enemy aircraft, more prisoners marching west than east. Yet for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, their orders had not changed. Even with the enemy collapsing, deception still mattered. Command feared that the remnants of German forces might attempt one last stand, perhaps in the southern mountains. Until surrender was certain, illusion remained a weapon. The men moved through the ruins of Cologne, their trucks winding past gutted cathedrals and bridges that ended mid-air. The scale of destruction defied belief. It was there, amid the shattered cityscape, that the artists of war felt the weight of their craft most deeply. They had created fake cities of light and sound, illusions of battle, and yet the real war had left behind ruins that no imagination could surpass. Still, they pressed forward, setting up their next deception near the Ruhr vast industrial basin, where German resistance was rumored to be regrouping. Their mission was to simulate the arrival of a full armored corps along the western edge, drawing what enemy attention remained away from the true encirclement moving from the south. They established their new positions in the shadow of broken smokestacks and rail lines, twisted like vines. The air stank of oil and scorched iron. They worked as they always had, silently, methodically, transforming empty space into an army. Tanks inflated among the rubble. Canvas tents rose where real ones once stood. Tracks were cut into the soft earth, and signs bearing the markings of non-existent divisions were planted at crossroads. The sound teams rolled out their speakers again, though the tapes hissed with wear from months of use. The recordings of engines and artillery blended with the real noise of war still echoing in the distance, so perfectly that even seasoned soldiers nearby could not distinguish one from the other. In the evenings, the men wandered through what had been homes, their boots crunching on glass. Some painted small murals on surviving walls, a tank here, a figure of a soldier there, as though marking their passage through a museum of ghosts. The war had stripped away its illusions of glory. What remained was exhaustion and the quiet pride of having endured. They had long since stopped talking about medals or promotions. What mattered now was to finish without being discovered, to perform the last act of their strange play without the audience ever realizing it was theater. Each operation grew shorter as the front advanced faster than expected. The enemy was unraveling. German units surrendered in clusters, their commanders disoriented, their radios silent. Yet, even in collapse, they were dangerous. Snipers lingered in ruined towns. Artillery still fired sporadically across the river valleys. One afternoon, while the 23rd was setting up decoys near Wessel, a stray shell landed close to their convoy. The blast tore through a sound truck, scattering debris across the road. No one was killed, but the men were shaken. They had been lucky too many times. They patched what they could and carried on, knowing that every mile brought them closer to the end. Their commanders spoke of one last grand deception, a final performance to cover the Allied sweep into central Germany. It was to be their curtain call. In early April, they deployed near the city of Kassel, staging what appeared to be the buildup of two armored divisions preparing to strike north. The real attack would come from another direction. By now, the men could build an entire illusion in less than 12 hours. Their hands moved with the instinct of craftsmen who no longer needed to think about the steps. They could inflate 50 tanks, paint them, and wire the sound system before dawn. Even in fatigue, they found a strange rhythm in the work artistry born of necessity. That night, the valley came alive with the hum of machinery, both real and imagined. The speakers played the layered roar of convoys moving through the dark. Fires burned in metal drums to mimic engine maintenance. The radio teams broadcast false orders with their familiar precision, their voices calm and detached as they spun a narrative of movements that did not exist. Across the front, German spotters once again took the bait. Artillery shells fell harmlessly on the decoy positions, while real divisions maneuvered in relative safety. It was a pattern repeated so many times that it now felt almost ritualistic, a dance of shadows guiding the war to its end. But the exhaustion of living in illusion began to catch up with them. They had been traveling without rest for nearly a year, their nerves worn thin by secrecy and the constant pressure of deception. In stolen moments, they spoke of home New York apartments, Iowa farms, places where silence didn't carry the echo of engines and gunfire. Some wondered aloud if anyone would ever believe what they had done, or if it would all vanish into rumor. Their orders forbade them from discussing their missions even after the war. It was as though they were fading into the very ghosts they had spent the war creating. As the days passed, the skies filled with Allied aircraft moving east in endless formations. The ground shook with the rumble of advancing armor. The German army was collapsing, surrendering by the tens of thousands. The Ghost Army's last illusions were barely needed now, yet they continued out of duty. The deception near Kassel was their final major operation. When it ended, they were told to stand by for reassignment. For the first time since their formation, there were no new orders, no maps to study, no new illusions to build. They waited in silence, unsure whether to feel relief or emptiness. One evening, as they camped beside a narrow river, they watched the sunset burn through the haze, staining the sky in crimson. The fields beyond were quiet, except for the distant rumble of artillery fading eastward. Someone set up a gramophone, and faint music drifted through the camp, scratchy, old, and fragile. The men sat together, listening, their faces lit by the glow of the fire. The war was ending, but none of them said it aloud. To name, it felt too dangerous, as if speaking the word might break the spell that had kept them alive. They had built their lives around illusion. Perhaps they feared that peace itself might be another one. Days later, they were ordered toward the Rhine once more. The fighting had moved beyond reach, into the heart of a crumbling empire. They passed columns of prisoners marching west, hollow-eyed and silent. In towns newly liberated, children stood by the roadside, waving at the convoys with hesitant smiles. The ghost army waved back, their faces half hidden by dust and fatigue. None of the civilians knew who they were or what they had done, and that anonymity felt strangely fitting. They had been invisible from the beginning. By mid-April, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops reached the outskirts of a small German village, their final station before demobilization. The men unpacked their gear one last time, though there were no more tanks to inflate, no sounds to project. The silence of the countryside pressed in around them, deeper and heavier than any they had known. For the first time in months, there was nothing to pretend. The real war was almost over, and their war, the war of illusion, had already ended. They sat beneath the blossoming trees, watching the last columns of smoke drift across the horizon, and felt the strange calm of a stage gone dark after the final performance. That night, a few of them stayed awake long after the camp went quiet. The stars were bright, and the wind carried the faint scent of blossoms from the orchards nearby. They talked about the operations they had run, the fake crossings, the rubber tanks, the nights when sound and shadow had fooled the enemy. They laughed at the absurdity of it all, but beneath the laughter there was pride. They had done something few could understand. They had turned imagination into armor. One man, staring at the fire, said softly that their work had proven that art could save lives. The others nodded. It was the only kind of monument they would ever have. The next morning, they began dismantling the camp for the last time. Tools were packed into crates, records sealed in envelopes marked top secret. The sound trucks were stripped of their loudspeakers, the compressors drained of air. The rubber tanks, once symbols of cunning and courage, were loaded onto flatbeds to be stored or discarded. When the final truck pulled away, the field was empty again. Grass bent under the weight of the wind, hiding the impressions of footprints that had carried an invisible army. Within weeks, new units would occupy the same ground, unaware of who had been there before. By the end of May, the men of the Ghost Army were scattered, some sent home across the Atlantic, others reassigned to occupation duties in Germany or Austria. Letters began to pass among them, filled with short, uncertain updates. The painters wrote of trying to return to their art, but finding only images of smoke and light in their minds. The soundmen spoke of static, of nightmares that began with the hiss of air through rubber. A few found their way into the new world of post-war design and advertising, where illusion again had value but no longer carried moral weight. None of them spoke much about the 23rd. They had promised secrecy, and old habits die hard. In the years that followed, their story faded into rumor. Commanders who had relied on their deception during the war seldom mentioned it in reports. The operations remained classified, the records locked away in military archives. The world moved on, remembering the famous battles, the generals, and the victories that filled history books. The Ghost Army became what it had always been: unseen, unspoken, an army that lived only in shadows. But memory has a way of surfacing, even from darkness. One afternoon in 1946, in a studio in New York, a young artist who had served with the 23rd painted a canvas of a misty field dotted with faint silhouettes of tanks. He titled it "The Quiet Front." It was not a battlefield scene. There were no soldiers, no smoke, no bodies, only the emptiness of aftermath, the echo of something that once was. The painting hung in a gallery for a few weeks before someone bought it and took it away. The artist never explained its meaning. He didn't have to. Those who had lived that strange war of illusion would have recognized it instantly. It was a portrait of absence of men who had fought by making others believe they were there when they weren't, and who now existed only in the same way, invisible but never forgotten. Summer came soft and green across the ruined continent. Fields that months before had been craters now rippled with young wheat. vines crept back over the collapsed walls of farmhouses. In towns where nothing had stood but rubble, new market stalls appeared beneath patched roofs. Europe was breathing again. And somewhere among the thousands of men boarding ships for home were the remnants of a unit that had never been officially named in dispatches. Their trucks rolled west toward the ports, paint peeling, the air hoses and loudspeakers packed away, their canvas ghosts folded tight. The voyage back to America was quiet. On deck, the men leaned against the rail and watched the gray ocean stretching without end. They spoke little of what they had done, because no one on board knew their story. When other soldiers asked what outfit they belonged to, they gave the same practiced answer: engineers, headquarters detail. Signal Corps whatever sounded ordinary. The truth felt impossible to explain. How could they describe a war fought with brushes, wires, and illusions? How could they make anyone understand that an army of air had walked beside the real one? When the ships reached New York, the skyline shimmered through morning haze like a painting coming to life. The harbor was filled with returning transports, the docks loud with bands and cheers. Crowds waved flags, tossing flowers to the soldiers. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops disembarked with the rest, blending into the tide of uniforms. No reporters met them, no photographers asked for names. Their service records listed no campaigns, no victories. They carried duffel bags that rattled with the remains of their craft paint-stained gloves, spools of wire, a folded photograph or two. They walked down the gangplank into a world that had never known they existed. In the weeks that followed, they scattered across the country. Some returned to schools they had left behind, others to families who barely recognized the hardened faces that came home. The painters set up easels again, but the colors on their palettes felt different. The sound engineers took jobs in radio studios, haunted by the memory of the recordings that had once made death change its direction. A few joined the new advertising agencies springing up in post-war cities, selling dreams instead of disguises. None of them spoke of the Ghost Army. The official silence remained absolute. The secrecy orders were still in force. They had learned to live inside that silence, carrying the story like a private sketch folded in a pocket. Years turned. The world moved on to other wars, other technologies. The names of generals and battles filled the books, but the artists of deception faded into rumor. Their records remained buried in classified archives, their photographs mislabeled or lost. Only among themselves did they sometimes talk, at reunions or chance meetings. They would laugh about the rubber tanks that deflated under artillery fire, the nights when a single recording had fooled an entire division. Yet beneath the laughter ran the old weight of memory, the knowledge that while they had fought to save others, their own part of the story was vanishing, erased by design. It was not until decades later, long after the Cold War had begun, that the truth began to surface. In the 1980s, historians digging through declassified files came across the strange designation 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The reports read like fiction. Descriptions of inflatable armor, sonic deception, fake radio nets. Photographs followed black and-white images of men standing beside rubber Shermans, smiling as if they knew the joke the world had missed. Veterans were found and interviewed, their memories still sharp after 40 years. Slowly, piece by piece, the Invisible Army took shape again in the public imagination. When the story finally became known, people were astonished. Newspapers called them the artists who fooled Hitler, the painters who won battles without fighting. Documentaries were made, exhibitions mounted. The surviving men, old now, stood under museum lights beside the artifacts of their youth. The speakers, the sketches, the faded maps with coded markings. They spoke modestly, sometimes shyly, about what they had done. Many said they never felt like heroes. They had only used what they knew: art, design, sound, to serve a purpose. But as the world listened, a quiet understanding grew that their work had saved lives beyond counting. Deception, when used to protect rather than destroy, had been its own form of courage. For those who had lived it, the recognition came late, but felt unreal. One veteran, a sculptor in his old age, said that the war had taught him that art was not fragile at all. It was a shield, as strong as any armor. Another, a sound engineer, now retired, remembered the nights in France when they played their recordings into the fog and heard the echo come back across the fields. It was like talking to ghosts, he said. Except we were the ghosts. As the last of them gathered for reunions, their stories folded gently into history. They visited the places where their illusions had once stood, fields in Normandy, ridges above the Rhine, valleys where the sound of phantom engines had rolled through the dark. The landscape had healed, but in quiet moments, they said they could still feel the pulse of what they had created, a faint vibration under the wind, as if the echoes of their false armies still moved somewhere just beyond sight. In 2013, a memorial was finally proposed, and years later, the U.S. Congress awarded the Ghost Army its long-delayed honors. The surviving veterans accepted the recognition with humility, their eyes clouded with age, but bright with pride. For the families of those long gone, it was a moment of vindication, a confirmation that the strange, secret craft of their fathers had truly mattered. History, at last, had turned to face its invisible artists. Now, when their story is told, it carries the calm wonder of something both improbable and true. In the vast machinery of the Second World War, amid the steel and fire, there had existed a small group of men who fought not with weapons, but with imagination. They had built armies from shadows, carved victory from illusion, and proven that creativity could stand beside courage on the battlefield. And though the world has changed, the echo of their work remains in every act of strategy, every campaign of misdirection, every reminder that belief itself can shape the course of war. The Ghost Army left no monuments of stone, no grand statues in city squares. Their legacy lies instead in the unseen, the quiet art of perception, the courage to make others believe in what is not there, so that life may endure where it still is. In the long silence after the war, they returned to their easels, their drafting tables, their studios. But sometimes, in dreams or in memory, the old sounds returned. The hiss of compressors inflating rubber, the low rumble of recorded engines, the flicker of lanterns over painted armor. The war they had fought was long over, but in the fading light of their years, they could still feel it, the faint heartbeat of a phantom army marching through history, invisible but everlasting. The days that followed were unlike any they had known. The air along the western plains of Germany was strangely still, filled with the faint, electric hum of an ending war. Columns of smoke rose from distant cities, but the thunder of artillery had faded to isolated rumbles. It was late April 1945. The Allies had crossed every river, pierced every defense. The Nazi regime was collapsing from within, and Berlin itself was under siege. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, who had spent the last year creating false armies and ghostly illusions, now found themselves in a world where the truth had finally overtaken the need for lies. Their last official assignment came quietly. It was not grand like Viersen, not vast like the Rhine crossing, but it carried the same precision that had defined their strange art. Near the city of Deceive, on the edge of the Elbe River, the Ghost Army was ordered to stage one more deception. Feint of presence, a show of force to mask the real movement of divisions converging toward the final battles to the east. Even as the German army disintegrated, there were pockets of resistance, snipers and bell towers, and convoys still fighting their way north. The ghosts were to give the illusion that a large American armored group was gathering to push eastward, holding German attention just a little longer while the Soviet armies closed in from the far side. They arrived at dusk, their trucks rolling over cracked roads lined with the wreckage of war. Broken carts, burned tanks, the carcasses of horses. The fields on either side were littered with fragments of uniforms and helmets, the aftermath of battles fought only days before. The sky was heavy with the scent of rain and iron. Once again, the men unpacked their familiar tools, hoses, compressors, rubber, sound reels, and began their ritual of creation. In the twilight, the shapes of Shermans and trucks began to rise from the earth like resurrected shadows, silent, gleaming faintly in the failing light. There was a calmness to their work now. No rush, no fear of discovery. The enemy was broken, and yet they performed their craft with the same meticulous care as ever. Painters brushed streaks of mud on the rubber holes. Sound engineers adjusted volume dials, ensuring the roar of engines carried just enough to be convincing, but not too loud to seem artificial. Radio operators sent their coded messages into the air, fully aware that few on the other side still had the means or will to listen. It was a performance for ghosts, now for the remnants of an army that no longer believed in its own existence. As they worked, word of the wider war filtered through the ranks. Rumors moved faster than official briefings. That Hitler was dead, that Berlin was surrounded, that surrender was only days away. No one knew what to believe. The men of the 23rd had lived too long in the world of deception to trust what they heard. Still, the air itself seemed different, thinner somehow, as if history were drawing a deep breath before speaking its final word. They could feel the weight of what was ending and the strange emptiness of what might follow. Their decoy camp near Deceive took shape overnight. Fires burned low under makeshift canopies. Inflated tanks lined the muddy fields, their outlines softened by fog. The sound units played the constant hum of engines and the clatter of tools. Through binoculars, any distant observer would see an army in motion, poised for another thrust eastward. German artillery, scattered and weakened, answered sporadically. Shells whistled across the fields and burst among the decoys, harmlessly shredding rubber and spraying mud. The men barely flinched anymore. They had been through worse, and soon even this would end. On the second night, as they tended to the speakers and checked the hoses for leaks, a soft rain began to fall. It pattered against the rubber tanks and pooled in the footprints of men who had been pretending to be soldiers for so long they sometimes forgot they were real ones. Across the field, a few men sat together under a tarp, passing a bottle of whiskey. They spoke quietly about home, about the strange future waiting for them after the curtain fell. One of them said that when he returned, he might never pick up a paintbrush again. Another laughed and said he would paint nothing but quiet fields and empty skies. By the third day, the illusion had done its job. Allied command confirmed that enemy forces north of Deceive had withdrawn, misled by the phantom division that never existed. The men received orders to stand down and prepare for redeployment. There would be no fanfare, no parades. The mission reports would be sealed and stamped with the word classified. Their work, so invisible and yet so vital, would vanish into the gray folds of military secrecy. They dismantled the camp for the last time, deflating the tanks, rolling the rubber into bundles, coiling the cables, silencing the speakers. When the last truck drove away, the field returned to stillness. Only the deep tracks in the mud hinted that an army had stood there. They followed the advancing columns east, passing through villages where the war was over in everything but name. Civilians emerged from cellars and barns, staring with hollow eyes at the endless convoys. Children watched in silence, uncertain whether to wave or hide. The ghost army waved back, their uniforms streaked with mud and exhaustion. They carried no trophies, only the tools of their illusion, worn and patched from a year of use. In towns where the church bells still hung intact, the sound of their tolling felt unreal, as though part of another deception. As April waned, the men reached the Elbe. The river ran wide and brown beneath a bright sky. On the far bank, Soviet forces could be seen through binoculars, tiny figures, moving among the ruins. For the first time, the ghost army had no role to play. There were no more secrets to hide, no more illusions to stage. The two great armies of the world had met, and truth, for once, was visible across the water. The men stood on the riverbank in silence, watching the Red Army soldiers waving back. Between them stretched a river that had divided not just nations, but the real from the unreal. That evening, as dusk settled, a few of the men lit small fires and sat quietly around them. The night was calm, and the sky above was clear. They spoke little. After so many months of invention and pretense, they were content to let silence carry the meaning. Somewhere far to the east, the last battles were being fought. Somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, the war was breathing its final breath. The ghost army waited, uncertain whether to feel pride or melancholy. They had fought without fighting, bled without bleeding, and won a war no one would ever see. A courier arrived before midnight with the news they had been expecting but never imagined hearing. Germany had surrendered in principle. The war was effectively over. There were still details to finalize, formal documents to sign, but for all practical purposes, it had ended. The camp stirred with quiet murmurs. Some laughed softly, others wept without sound. A few men simply lay back and stared at the stars, too tired to feel anything at all. The illusion, after all these months, had finally become unnecessary. The world no longer needed ghosts. The next morning, the sun rose over a land still heavy with smoke, but beneath it, the air felt lighter. The men packed their equipment one final time. The compressors hissed as they bled the last of their air, and the rubber tanks lay flat in the dew, their surfaces wrinkled and still. The sound trucks stood silent, their reels coiled and empty. The artists, engineers, and radio men climbed into their trucks and drove away, leaving behind only faint tracks that the wind soon erased. For the first time since their creation, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had no more illusions to build, no more enemies to deceive. They had performed their final act, and as they disappeared down the long, broken road, the fog rose once more over the empty fields, swallowing the last traces of the army that had never been. May 1945. The war in Europe was finished. The guns that had shaken the continent into rubble were finally silent. In towns across Germany, white flags hung from windows, fluttering weakly in the spring air. Smoke still drifted from distant factories and bombed rail yards, but it was the smoke of ending, not of battle. Along those ruined roads rolled the trucks of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, their engines steady, their cargo no longer secret. The men who had lived by illusion now moved through a world struggling to remember what was real. They had orders to hold in a small valley outside the city of Trier, where the army was gathering its logistics units for redeployment. For the first time in nearly a year, there was no deception to plan, no radio traffic to simulate, no sounds of war to fabricate. The sudden quiet felt unreal. They slept without setting guards. They woke to birdsong instead of artillery. The compressors, silent now, stood like relics of a forgotten craft. Some of the men joked that they should inflate the tanks one last time and leave them behind as a monument to absurdity. Others said nothing at all, only stared at the river below the camp, where the reflection of the sky looked too peaceful to belong to a land that had seen so much fire. Each morning, trucks brought groups of prisoners along the road, German soldiers, ragged and silent, moving west under guard. Many were no older than the Ghost Army's own men. They passed each other without words. The artists and radio men who had spent a year pretending to be armies now looked at the defeated enemy and saw not villains, but reflections of themselves, young faces drained of purpose, caught in the machinery of something larger than either side could control. The war had been a performance for everyone, they thought, and they had simply mastered its stagecraft more completely. In nearby villages, civilians crept out from cellars and ruins, rebuilding their lives brick by brick. The Ghost Army helped where they could, handing out rations, clearing roads, mending roofs with spare canvas. For many of the men, it was the first time they felt visible, their actions direct and tangible instead of hidden behind smoke and illusion. They were learning how to live without secrecy. Yet beneath the relief ran a thread of melancholy. Their work, the art of deception, had ended as quietly as it began, leaving no trace of its victories, no public record of its cost. In the evenings, they gathered outside the tents, talking softly as the sun set behind the hills. The light lingered longer each day, the season turning toward summer. Someone would produce a bottle of wine scavenged from a nearby cellar, and the conversation would drift to what they might do when they went home. The painters spoke of returning to their studios, though most admitted they no longer saw the world the same way. The sound engineers talked of working in radio again, though the static and hum of their old equipment now reminded them of nights when illusion had meant survival. They all carried the war within them, but in ways too strange for medals or stories. Rumors spread through the camp that the unit would soon be disbanded. The war in the Pacific still raged, but their skills, it was said, were not needed there. They were European ghosts, built for the soil and sky of this continent's tragedy. Their commanding officers confirmed the news a few days later. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops would be deactivated. The men would be reassigned, demobilized, or sent home. There was no ceremony, no farewell parade. Orders were simply handed out, papers signed, equipment inventoried for storage. The army that had never existed was now being officially erased. Before they left, the men decided to gather for one last photograph. They assembled in front of a line of deflated tanks, the rubber shells draped across the grass like the carcasses of great beasts. Behind them, the ruins of a German farmhouse stood against the horizon. Someone set up a camera on a tripod and gave the signal. They stood still for a moment, faces tired, expressions calm. When the shutter clicked, it captured the image of men who had fought a war without ever being seen. None of them could have known that the photograph would become one of the few surviving records of their existence.